This is the story of liberty with your host, John Bona.
What will you do without freedom? Will you fight? Fight against that? No! We will run, and we will live. Aye. Fight and you may die. Run, and you'll live. At least a while. And dying in your beds many years from now, would you be willing to trade all the days from this day to that for one chance, just one chance, to come back here and tell our enemies that they may take our lives, but they'll never take our freedom?
Well, good evening, and welcome to the Story of Liberty. I'm your host, John Bona, and with me are Dr. Marshall Foster and theologian Dan Williamson. Good evening, guys.
Good morning, John.
Good evening. Good evening, John.
Well, great to hear you. Dan, it's just so you know, it's the evening here in South Florida, so...
oh, yeah, that's right.
Hey, it's good to be here with you guys. You know, we're 1 week out from celebrating the 4th of July, Independence Day. And, you know, I one of the stories, Marshall, and I heard you give this up in Washington at one of your tours with the World History Institute a few years ago when you were talking about Valley Forge. And that whole story just amazed me, and how it begun when, you know, we had some victories up there in Saratoga in New York when 7,000 men surrendered. It's probably the greatest single victory of the war in 1776. But as we know, that bright moment soon passed, and gloom kind of returned to encircle the American cause. And Philadelphia, America's chief city, had now become a British camp. And liberty and independence, once within the grasp of Americans, seemed to be a forgotten dream. And for the first time, America as a whole were confronted with the hard facts of the real circumstances. And locked in this desperate struggle for survival, they were back towards the precipice of surrender by the great British Empire. And, you know, though they were fighting for every inch of the ground, there was some question as to how long America could hold out. And, you know, you could just think of the great George Washington, how that must have weighed on his mind as he sat on his big gray horse and watched the men file silently past him in that cold December day and into Valley Forge, the site that, you know, he had chosen for their winter encampment. And it was a good site to choose. There was fields nearby for drilling. There was ample wood for fuel and shelter. And they said strategically Washington could not have picked a better location. But I think few of the men probably who went past him in the snow ever had heard of Valley Forge. But as we know, this is a name that will be chiseled in the cornerstone of our nation's history. The men were exhausted and hungry and freezing, and they had long given up any hope for a warm bed and supper or even a pair of stockings. Many of them had no stockings. Their footgear consisted of strips of blanket around their feet, and they would wear out quickly. And then they'd be walking through the snow barefoot. You know, they said this entire army of 11,000 men, less than a dozen were equipped for the terrible winter that lie ahead at Valley Forge. But, you know, the men didn't complain. And, you know, perhaps as they were marching into that dark night of the nation's young soul, they prayed to God for deliverance. But now came the time of testing. That sooner or later, Marshall, always seems to come upon every covenanted body of Christians on this continent. And I've heard you tell the story about the Pilgrims and the Puritans, how they faced their starving times up in Plymouth. But now it was Valley Forge. And in later centuries would become known as the Crucible of Freedom. And this was it. You know, Washington himself designed these huts where the men would sleep, these log cabins. They were 16 feet long. Dan, you're an architect, so you know all about this. They were 4 feet wide and 6 feet high. And they could hold 12 men, but, you know, there were no windows or flooring. There were some holes there to let the smoke out. But they built 700 of these cabins, and not until the last man was quartered did Washington leave his own leaky tent right on the site there at Valley Forge to the relative comfort of Isaac Potts' home, which would serve as his headquarters. But our listeners, I wanted you guys to understand something. What these men went through was unbelievable. The disease was taking a fearful toll, and they would lose 1 in 4 men that winter to flu, smallpox, typhus, or exposure to the elements, to freezing weather. But George Washington didn't spare himself. Early in the morning, he would begin and make the rounds of the camp, and he would spend most of the day riding from one regiment to the next, talking to the men. But ironically, Congress didn't help. And, 90 miles away, Congress was there. And we had great men in leadership before this time with Adams and Franklin and John Hancock. But now others were in their place, and they were consumed with petty bickering and really united in their jealousy, as we read in history, against Washington. They convinced each other that his needs were exaggerated. And instead of sending wagons and victuals and winter clothing, for which he pleaded over and over, they merely sent more paper money. They printed money. And, they thought he would use this money to pay for his troops could buy things and purchase what he needed. But from the beginning, life in Valley Forge was grim. These huts were smoky and dark, and they didn't have a lot of food to eat. They would cook out on a kettle of water and on a big stone on an open fire with some wheat or cornmeal, whatever they could find. And as the winter wore on, it got worse. The list of sick and dead mounted, and life in Valley Forge became an unbearable nightmare. Now there were men that were literally naked, because even the rags that they used to wrap around them, they were no longer there. Now finally Congress sent somebody to go down and look at them, and they were shocked to find out how many feet and legs froze till they became black. And it was often necessary to amputate them. Exposure to the elements combined with the starvation diet made the conditions for the diseases now that ravaged the camp. And when mid-February hit, Washington wrote this, and I wanted to this is something he actually wrote down. He said, "I'm convinced beyond a doubt that unless some great and capital change suddenly takes place, this army must inevitably be reduced to one or other of 3 things: starve, dissolve, or disperse." See, this then was the true miracle of Valley Forge. The men endured. It's amazing how they endured to these circumstances. But the one reason they endured, they believed in God's deliverance. But they also believed in their general, because the general believed, General Washington. And Washington made no secret of his faith. He would have services every Sunday and would call the men out to come out and show their Christian character, even in these difficult situations. You know, pastors were preaching around this time, and the news spread finally about this tremendous spiritual struggle that was being waged at Valley Forge. And more sermons, Marshall, I've read this in the political sermons of the founding era. More and more sermons were likening Washington to Moses. And, you know, there were obvious parallels. The similarity in his choosing to partake in the same hardships as his men. And we read that in Scripture. By faith, Moses, when he had come to years, he refused to be called the son of the Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God. So Washington covenanted himself with his men in the suffering at Valley Forge. While a day's ride away, the British sat warm and fed, enjoying an after-dinner brandy by the fireside. See, in this crucible of freedom, God was forging the iron of this army. The soldiers that came through Valley Forge were tempered into a carbon steel core around which this army could be built. And it's amazing how, I'm going to turn this over to you guys because I could keep going talking about Valley Forge, but just one more thought. You know, when they found an unlikely agent to help these men and train them, and it was Frederick Wilhelm Augustus Baron von Steuben, a former captain in the Prussian army, and he was well recommended by Ben Franklin. And Washington quickly recognized his expertise to train these men. And they came out of there, and by the spring, he had drilled the men to a point where they could produce a crisp volley every 15 seconds. And now March turned into April, and this Continental Army that came out of Valley Forge began to march as one. And you know what, George Washington, they gave George Washington the credit. But Marshall and Dan, I know you know this, George Washington gave God the credit, didn't he?
Yes, absolutely. You know, one of the tests of a great leader is where does he go when things are the darkest? And there's a story about a man named Isaac Potts. You mentioned him earlier. He was traveling through the woods, and keep in mind, Valley Forge is out in the wilderness at this time in history, 1778 to 1777. And he comes upon the general of the army kneeling next to his horse, as the famous picture depicts. George Washington went to prayer, and he interceded on behalf of his starving, sick, freezing, and unpaid army. And Isaac Potts saw and observed George Washington praying, and he hid in the woods, and he watched him. And he went back to his home, and keep in mind, he was a Tory Quaker, which means he wasn't terribly on board with this whole American declaration. And he goes to his wife as he plops in his chair, somewhat disgruntled, and he looks at his wife, and he says, you know, if there is anyone on this earth whom the Lord will listen to, it is George Washington. And I feel a presentiment that under such a commander there can be no doubt of our eventually establishing our independence, and that God in his providence has willed it so. That's one of the keys to the victory in America. God raises up generations. And people think George Washington came out of nowhere, John Adams came out of nowhere. And part of the providence and the miracle of the events of the 1776 to 1781, and actually prior to that, is God had prepared generations of men and women to be ready to pledge their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor to something beyond themselves. Just like the Pastor John Robinson, when he told the Pilgrims, you're going to go to the New World and you may die there, but you're going to plant seed for future generations. There's no different. George Washington and his troops had a vision for something far bigger than themselves. So although the 12,000 went in, like the army of Gideon, God says, I only need 300 that actually are ready for the battle. And in George Washington's army was run through that crucible, as you put it, John, so well. And what came out was an army that could fire 4 rounds a minute, could stand in their ranks, would not break, which was critical in European warfare, and were led by a leader of high character. And, of course, his whole providential view begins with prayer, because God is going to win the victory, not man. And I think that's an important thing to keep in mind about a man like George Washington. By the providence of God, he was prepared and put in a position such as this, for a time such as this, to bring forward God's providence and his will.
You know, that's the way God works in history. It's interesting that John Adams, when he signed the Declaration of Independence in 1776 on July 3rd, he predicted the kind of travail and trial that Washington's army was going to have. He said on that day, writing to his wife, he said, "It may be the will of heaven that America shall suffer calamities still more wasting and distresses yet more dreadful. If this is to be the case, it will have this good effect, at least. It will inspire us with many virtues which we have not, and correct many errors and follies and vices which threaten to disturb, dishonor, and destroy us. The furnace of affliction produces refinement in states as well as individuals." Think of that in terms of our situation today, guys. That's what happens. God does give providential events, and we're going to talk about those that bring victory, and that are really the deciding factor, not only in war but in peace. But the truth is that God uses these afflictions in our life, like the afflictions the Army went through right back there in the war, to bring them character. In fact, George Washington made a point that when he spoke to his army, he did not go after the British and their lack of character, even though the British lack of character was one of the main reasons they were fighting, because they were killing their wives in the homes of their farms, and the Prussian soldiers were raping and pillaging the whole countryside. So they had ample reason to be mad at the British. But Washington's command to his troops was that they clean up their own lives so that they would be ready for the blessings of God. Let me just give you this one quote from General Henry Muhlenberg, a former pastor who had become one of his key generals. He said this just after they left Valley Forge on May 7th, 1778. He said, this is what Muhlenberg said of Washington. He said, I heard a fine example today, namely that His Excellency George Washington rode around among his army yesterday and admonished each and every one to fear God, to put away the wickedness that has set in and become so general, and to practice the Christian virtues. From all appearances, this gentleman does not belong to the so-called world of society. He's talking about Washington here. He says, for he respects God's word, he believes in the atonement through Christ, and bears himself in humility and gentleness. Therefore, the Lord God has also singularly, yea, miraculously preserved him from harm in the midst of countless perils, ambushes, fatigues, and has hitherto graciously held him in his hand as a chosen vessel. But isn't it interesting that Washington doesn't tell his men how bad the British are, he tells them how bad they are, in the sense that if they don't act like Christian gentlemen, then they have no reason to expect God's providence to intervene on their behalf. What an interesting perspective that we need in our present day, that the battles of our day really begin in ourselves, don't they?
Absolutely. You know, Marshall, nothing could be more true than the real battle begins right at the kitchen table. And I think we've said that earlier, that if God's principles are brought forward and taught within each family in the homes of America, most of these problems begin to go away. And we need to look back at some of the great stories of history, because history, in fact, is his story, his with a capital H, God's story. And we can see the fingerprints of God all through history in the establishment of this nation. And it really was always built around a very small group of people who understood God's principles and applied them in every area of life, and did not apologize, but really started with the inward control. In other words, ruled from within, not from without. And that's the key to our American republic. If we lose the ability to govern from within, then there will be those that will choose to govern from without. And that's what we're struggling with today. We write laws upon laws upon laws to try to solve all these problems, when in fact most of those problems should begin from within and be solved from within families or churches in a very intimate setting instead of on the public sphere. And that's why it's so true. We need to raise up a generation of godly men and women with that Christian character where they go to the Lord in prayer, because that's where their strength is going to come from. Not from the strength of their arm, but the strength of what God is going to do through their lives.
It's encouraging that the governor of Texas is calling for the people of America to come to Houston in August for a day of humiliation and prayer. And he's actually called all the leaders, all the governors of the state, to come to the stadium and just stand on the floor of the stadium with all the other Americans and call out to God for his mercy in America. That's very interesting that Governor Perry would do that. And I think it speaks of what happened during the American Revolution, doesn't it, men, where the patriot pulpit was aflame with righteousness, and it spoke the truth and said, man, let's prepare ourselves, because unless we prepare ourselves in our own hearts, then the providence of God will not go with us. And that spiritual preparation is the beginning of any kind of reformation in our country. And that's the way they saw it in those days. And of course, then God went on to, in his great providence, give them miracle after miracle after miracle against all odds, defeating the most powerful army in the world. And there's no way they could have won this battle without God's divine providence.
Exactly.
Let me just go ahead.
Go ahead, Dan.
Go ahead, John.
No, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say that, Marshall, you tapped right in that story where Adams travels over there to Lexington and Concord, and he meets with Jonas Clark, the pastor of many of the men that stood and fired those first shots. And Adams says, will they fight? And Clark says, not only will they fight, I have taught them and prepared them. That's why the power of the Black Regiment is a fearful thing, because if you teach the principles to defend and protect, and the concept of Luke 4 that Jesus set the captives free, there is the story of liberty. That is the liberty man, the man that will put everything on the line to do what's right to protect the innocent. And that's a great story in itself.
Oh, it certainly is.
And yeah,
it certainly is, Dan. You mentioned the Liberty Man. Of course, Marshall and I, and you'll be involved with a film that we're doing now called Monumental, that will be released hopefully this Thanksgiving. We're doing this film with Kirk Cameron, and it's exciting. It's exactly what you said, Dan, about self-governing, kind of looking in the mirror first and looking at yourself and governing yourself under God's law. And then taking that to your family and your church and your cities. And then we see how liberty, the liberty man you mentioned, how that's in Liberty Women, of course, this includes women, Liberty Women, and how this is lived out in society through political, economic, and religious liberty. And we're excited about that, Marshall. As you know, some of our listeners may know, Marshall did the written storyline, the whole thing for the film. And this is going to be an amazing documentary that'll be coming out around Thanksgiving called Monumental. We're very excited about it. We're in post-production and getting all the bells and whistles on there. Right, Marsh?
Oh, that's right. And John, I think that the audience should be not only aware of the movie that's coming, but if they want to go online, they can check it out at monumentalmovie.com and join in with their emails and become involved in the process as the film gets ready to come out, so we can bring it to your theater in your town.
Okay.
And we believe this is going to bring about a mighty thinking revolution,
yes,
spiritual revolution in our country.
Okay, well, we're going to break away. We're winding up here the first half. We'll be back in a minute with the story of liberty. Welcome back to the Story of Liberty. I'm your host, John Bona, and with me are Dr. Marshall Foster and Dan Williamson. Well, we're a week out from Independence Day 2011, and we're just talking about the great stories that happened to bring us our liberty. And, one of them, Marshall, and I've heard you tell this story many times about the Brooklyn Heights, which is part of that Crucible of Freedom story, really. But as we know that the British had nearly surrounded the Americans up there, and the order for attack was given in late August of 1776. And the Americans were overwhelmed and fell back to their final defensive perimeter around the northern tip of Brooklyn. And I say that, I hope our listeners up in New York, we have listeners up in the New York area now. Be proud of your area. And all that afternoon, the Americans held their breath because they were waiting for the final British assault, which would finish them off. They were outnumbered more than 3-1. It was something like 24,000 to 8,000. And they were low on gunpowder as usual. And the British fleet would soon be in the East River right on their back. You know, dark thoughts must have gone through the minds of many of them that day. And it had been a noble revolution. There were days of glory. And no matter what happened in the next few hours, the British can never take away from them the memory of Lexington and Concord or Bunker Hill. Liberty, it had been worth the cause for dying for. I mean, but now they faced this grim reality of how great the odds were really against them. The ministers were telling them, put your trust in God. He's with us. He'll see us through. But the men were thinking, where was he now? And so they waited and waited and waited. And they never really knew that God was with them all the time. And amazingly, this great General Howe, who was the British general, against all military logic, once again failed to follow up on the obvious advantage he had. And this was no dull general. This was a brilliant general. He surrounded them the night before in this brilliantly conceived, flawlessly executed plan. And he took the Americans entirely by surprise. But it became apparent that Howe was not going to attack. It was a miracle. And no one really knew why, but this was opening the curtain on what would be probably the most amazing episode of divine intervention in the Revolutionary War. And all that day, the Americans continued to wait. They were hungry, they were tense, they were exhausted. And the British guns remained silent all that day. In the late afternoon, a cold rain began to fall, and it kept falling all night and soaking them. They had no tents. They were lightly clothed, and they were hungry, as I said. And then the rain came from the northeast, and that northeast wind as well prevented General Howe's fleet from entering the East River. And now the great George Washington, our first president, had a plan. It was a desperate gamble and dependent on so many unlikely variables that some of the people around him couldn't even consider it a plan. But it was better than suicidal defense, 3 against 1. And if only God's grace would favor them again. And Washington called a council of his generals around him, his senior officers, rather, and they decided to take the entire army off Brooklyn by a small boat. And this was an amazing opportunity. Now, most of the officers, they all knew that the British would do the same thing. They would get on small boats and chase them out. But the first thing they needed, obviously, were boats and men to handle them. And By coincidence, through John Glover's company of Marbleheaders, they were called, they were able to summon all these small boats. And all night long, these men made this treacherous 2-hour round trip over the East River and back to Manhattan and back to Manhattan and back. At first, they had to fight the wind and the stormy chop. And but at midnight, the wind died down. And now they had to quietly go through the waters so the British wouldn't hear him. And all night, these men had waited in line to be taken off the beach. It seemed like an impossible evacuation. And with the clearing of the night, it became crucial also to maintain a screen of men in front position so the British wouldn't suspect a withdrawal. But the men finally had to get in the boats, and perhaps for a full half hour passed, which there was no single defender visible anywhere in the American lines. And now the night was so clear and so well lit by moonlight that the enemy could be clearly seen. But for some reason, there was no attack at that moment, and they realized they needed a few more hours to get the last man across. And what happened next should be told by the one who saw it. Major Ben Talmud said this. He said, "Those of us who remained in the trenches became very anxious for our own safety. And when the dawn appeared, there were several regiments still on duty. At this time, a very dense fog began to rise out of the ground and off the river. I recollect this peculiar providential occurrence perfectly well. And so very dense was the atmosphere, I could scarcely discern a man at 6 yards distance." See, virtually every man who kept a diary that day recorded the fog. And most of them made a point of giving credit to where it was due, to God. But the fog remained intact until the last boat with George Washington in it had departed. Then it lifted. And it shocked the British, because when they ran to the shore and they started firing after them, the Americans were out of range. Nearly 8,000 men had been extricated from certain death or imprisonment without the loss of one single life. So, folks, it's so obvious here, thanks to God who brought the storm, the wind, a fog, and too many human coincidences to number, there was still a Continental Army that would go to victory. And Marshall, nobody tells that story better than you, but I took that one in advance.
That's great. That's great. And that was seen throughout the Revolution. As we were saying earlier in our time together, there was a preparation that the Army, the American Continental Army, went through, and from the very beginning, they were so outnumbered, there's no way they could win battle after battle. In fact, that was the one big providential event that kept the Army alive. The one you just told kept those 8,000 troops from dying that day. But they went on to have to fight a defensive war against those 25,000, 30,000 troops all the way through New York and into New Jersey for the next 7 months. They lost 7 battles in a row. The first battle, this one fort was attacked and 2,900 Americans were taken, put on ships, one of them called the Jersey, in which all of them died. Ended up that 16,000 Americans died of disease or were starved to death on these ships out in the New York harbor. But throughout all this trial that eventually brought them to the despair of the moment of Valley Forge, they were kept alive, just enough of them so that the British could not declare victory. And 7 months later, after they'd lost 7 battles in a row, they were down to 2,500 troops. And about a third of those were going to quit in about 3 days. And it was Christmas of 1776, and they're across a river, and right next to them is this little town of Princeton, where the German Hessians had 1,200 troops, and they were crack troops ready to fight and kill, and there were 14,000 British right behind them. And General Washington decided, what do you do when you're outnumbered by about 10,000 to 2,000? Well, you attack. And so he did on Christmas night. He attacked at the very moment that the Germans were partying all night. And in the middle of the night, there was this terrible storm with hail and snow. And in the middle of that storm, he got those little boats again, and he brought them across that river in the middle of the night and attacked the Hessian camp. And when he did there at Trenton, he didn't have one person killed, but he killed over 200 of the Hessians, took 1,000 prisoners, and escaped back across the river. And 4 of his men died of the weather, but not one of them was shot. It was a miracle. And it changed the course of the war, because people around America heard about this event. And they heard about 3 days later when Washington went across the river again and attacked a British contingent larger than themselves. And as they did at Princeton, there was a head-to-head battle with the British. And in this battle, the British came across with their fixed bayonets, and it was the first head-to-head large battle of its kind. And usually the Americans would run because they still were not that well trained. This is before Valley Forge. But the British came across, the Americans began to run from the field, and their general ran out in the middle of the field, less than 100 yards from the British troops that were coming, in front of his own troops. And he turned to his troops and lifted his sword. He says, "The battle has just begun, gentlemen." He went through the entire war with never being shot, his horse never being shot, and yet his troops turned and saw their general behind them. They rushed and took the field, and they won another battle. It happened again and again like that throughout the Revolution, so that by the time you get to 1781, the British must have begun to think that the weather was against them more than that, but the providence of God was against them, because the war had shifted to the south by this time in 1780 and 81, and General Cornwallis was down there with a force that greatly outnumbered the small force of the Americans that was in the south under Daniel Morgan. And at the Battle of Cowpens on January 17th of 1781, the Americans faced off and defeated Colonel Tarleton's entire detachment at Cowpens. The result was that Cornwallis heard of this and came running with his 10,000 troops, dropped his heavy baggage, and began to chase the Americans. And as the Americans ran for their lives because they were so outnumbered, they began to go across rivers in South Carolina, then North Carolina, into Virginia. And over a period of 13 days, they crossed 3 large rivers. And every time they crossed the river, there would be a flood. Usually there would be some storm that would come up. And for example, the first one, the Catawba River, just 2 hours after the Americans crossed, here come the British, and they had to wait till the next day because the river was stormed. The second time they crossed the Yadkin, and again it happened. The next morning the British arrived, they couldn't get across. The third river, as they went into Virginia, the Dan River, it happened again. It was so providential that it was General Cornwallis himself that wrote to General Clinton, his superior, and said, "Here the Royal Army was again stopped by a sudden rise of the waters, which had only just fallen, almost miraculously, to let the enemy over. Who could not else have eluded Lord Cornwallis' grasp? So close was he upon their rear." There's no reason he wouldn't have won, but he had to admit that it was but miraculous. Well, yes, it was. And so Cornwallis found himself having to go over to Yorktown and wait for relief from the north with his now 8,000 troops. And he's over at Yorktown along the river there waiting for the obvious Navy, the British Navy, that's going to come to their relief. But the Navy doesn't come because General Clinton doesn't like Cornwallis, and so he puts off the time of sending his ships. And miraculous things begin to happen. General Washington leaves New York in a providential march and marches silently without the Northern British Army knowing it down to Yorktown. At the same time, Robert Morris gives enough money so they have money to pay the troops. Otherwise, they could have never made it south. At the same time, the French decide to send their fleet from the West Indies at this very moment, and the French fleet arrives there a few days before the British fleet. There's a sea battle, and it's a draw, and the English withdraw all the way back to New York to fix up their ships, and the French are left in the bay to take care of the rear end of the British, so the British can't escape. And finally, on the last night, when Cornwallis is beside himself at Yorktown, he's being bombarded by the Americans and the French, and he doesn't know what to do. He gets on little boats and he begins to go across the river. But suddenly, as he begins to go across the York River, which is only about 500 yards wide, he finds that there's a tornado-like storm that comes up, and his boats go in circles, and he has to land back on the land there at Yorktown, and he has to declare the next day surrender for his Southern Army, which ended to be the last battle of the war. In fact, it was George Washington who said this right after the battle. He wrote to the President of Congress. He says, "I take particular pleasure in acknowledging that the interposing hand of heaven in the various instances of our extensive preparation for this operation has been most conspicuous and remarkable." This happened throughout the war, that God again and again and again stepped into the American cause. Why? Because they were in the right, because it was God's timing for liberty to explode upon the earth. And from that day, and that's why it's said by John Adams and by John Quincy Adams, his son, the fact that the Declaration of Independence and the American Revolution really is the tie between the liberty that Christ had promised at the cross and brought to so many millions of people through the centuries, and a civil liberty that came in America that has brought liberation to so many nations and to hundreds of millions of people around the world over the past 235 years. All of that because of God's divine providence in the American Revolution.
And you listen to those powerful stories, and I want to encourage parents everywhere that are sitting around kitchen tables with all your children there. You are training up the next George Washington. And we don't want to put George Washington on an impossible pedestal, but we have to acknowledge that obviously the divine providence of God was there, and people had poured into his life, preparing his character and his ability to lead, because you see the way he handled things. I mean, when you're completely beaten, what do? You charge. And those stories go back even before the American Revolution. There's the great story of the Battle of the Wilderness, July 9th of 1755. Braddock and his troops are ambushed by French and Indians on all sides. And the natives, of course, are shooting all the British soldiers off their horses. And they see this one great white soldier, this one soldier riding up and down the ranks. And so the chiefs say, "Zero all your guns in on this one. This man clearly knows how to fight like we do." And they all start shooting. And these Indians go, "What is going on here? I mean, we're shooting at this man, and he's not falling. This man is under the protection of the Great Spirit. This man was not born to be killed by a bullet," is one of the quotes from the Indians. After the battle, George Washington, as this young British officer, of course, takes off his tunic and sees all these bullet holes in his tunic. 2 horses had been shot beneath him. And his quote is, "By the all-powerful dispensations of providence, I have been protected beyond all human probability or expectation. For I had 4 bullets through my coat and 2 horses shot under me, yet escape unhurt, although death was leveling my companions on every side." Years later, one of the chiefs that was in the battle said, "I've got to meet this man face to face." And he comes up to George Washington many years later. This is one of the warriors, the Indian warriors in the battle. He says, "Listen, you will become the chief of nations. And a people yet unborn will hail you as the founder of a mighty empire. I am come to pay homage to the man who is the particular favorite of heaven and who can never die in battle." I just want to encourage parents that you may have these great warriors in your midst, and you have a great responsibility to train them up in prayer and character. George Washington exhibited this again at the end of the war, after the whole war was over. In 1784, many of his troops, of course, were somewhat despondent by the fact they hadn't been properly paid, their pensions had not been settled, and he walks in upon his officers uninvited. They were gathering because many of them thought that George Washington should be king. And after all, people can be comfortable with what they know. And Washington walked in, and after he calmed them down, he said, "Gentlemen, excuse me." As he pulled out his spectacles, he said, "You know, I have not only grown old and gray, but nearly blind in the service of our country." In one fell swoop, he told his men there would not be a king. There would not be a Napoleon. We have fought too hard. And that is the kind of character that we need to build in the next generation. And I believe it's underway. And I think there's great hope for where we're heading with some of the youth we have out there. And that story's got to, these stories need to be told, as Reagan put it, at your kitchen tables. And it needs to be taught, because God tells us to remember the heights from which we have fallen. We need to tell the old stories, just like crossing the Jordan at those memory stones. We gather at the memory stones, and Grandpa says, "Well, son, let me tell you about this pile of stones. Let me tell you the stories about what God did." And that's really what today's talk has been about. It's about the stories of God, His story amongst His people, who put their life, their fortune, and their sacred honor all at risk so that we could be free.
Well said, Dan.
That's right.
Well said. You know, and as we're winding up today's program, I guess we got a few minutes left here, Kelly. You know, entering into a covenant is really important. You know, God has called the people of America, as we heard our great President Ronald Reagan say, to be a city set on a hill. And since, frankly, we have repeatedly betrayed that covenant, it should hardly come as a surprise that his dealings with America are now more severe. Yet, you know, in the midst of God's judgment can be seen his mercy. While he does deal, you know, with his people more strictly than with others, he does not reject them. And when he enters into a covenant, and here's the good news, it's forever. And the promises which he made to the early comers of this great land, they remain intact. They're unmodified. Though, you know, now a far greater amendment of our lives is needed to fulfill our end of the bargain. See, for a whole nation to return to this covenant way that Dr. Foster has been preaching for 30 years, it seems impossible. But it is not impossible because it's been done before. And we have the biblical example of Nineveh to prove it. The biggest, most powerful city of its age and its corruption. And then the reluctant prophet Jonah. They gave the people of Nineveh one last chance. And Nineveh repented. And from the smallest to the greatest, they left their old ways and they were spared. But, you know, whether the end comes with a big bang or a whimper in America, we might be nearly at our national point of no return. And it's not too late for America. That's the good news. It's not too late to turn back. And that is the mercy of God. And he does not even require a whole nation to repent. If only the Christians who truly know him, as we're told in 2 Chronicles 7:14, would do this. And I quote, "If my people who are called by my name shall humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven, forgive their sin, and heal their land." Folks, there is hope. God bless you. Have a good evening, and thank you for joining us at the Story of Liberty. Good night.